Everybody with us? All right. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Am I on here? Okay, good. All right. Well, welcome back after our Christmas and New Year's hiatus, and then goes on with that. Now we got cold weather going on, which is a challenge too. So we're continuing the Tibetan tradition of mental development. It's a very fundamental book, but one that I've found very helpful. Um, it's incredibly detailed, but it's like a skeleton of um, of the Mahayana. Um, and we had just finished the first noble truth, um, the fact of suffering. And I just find these four noble truths so critical, really, especially the first noble truth. The fact of the existence of suffering. I ponder sometimes how, imagine if you were Gautama sitting under that tree after all the efforts that you had done, and then suddenly you come to omniscience. It's so faith inspiring to me that he hesitated to teach. It just really makes sense because this samsara is so completely real to us. Um, and the motivation to be born in samsara is mixed. I mean, there's tremendous amount of merit to be born as a human being, but there's also a tremendous amount of ignorance and of negative karma. So we're kind of suspended between two worlds, so to speak. And it's very hard to overcome. Buddhas are rare. And what a paradoxical kind of thing, though every single being is a Buddha, they just don't know it. So he starts out, but then what do you do when you're going to teach? What would be the first thing that you would say? And interestingly, it is the existence of suffering. And it strikes me again and again how wise that is. I mean, I guess you would expect it to be wise, but in the depths of it, because what is it that we share with every being and every human being, no matter what their religion, no matter what, it's this fact that we're all in this situation where there's dissatisfaction from top to bottom. But what isn't understood, so immediately there's a complete kind of unity, you might say, or a brother and sisterhood with everything alive. And of course, you see right there the unity of compassion. What the Buddhists mean by compassion, because we're just completely at one with all these beings in really our fundamental desires. We're doing everything to try to be happy, to try to avoid suffering. And it's just the great culture, more than cultural, it's a great existential universal. But suffering, we hear this word suffering, and in Sanskrit it's dukkha, which doesn't quite mean, when we hear suffering, I'll get into that. We usually have a kind of limited view of suffering, whereas dukkha apparently is the Sanskrit word describing, the quality of an ox cart or a chariot where the axle wasn't centered on the wheels. And so, the wheels are turning, but with everything is just like friction. And so you're going somewhere, but you're not really going. You can't depend on the machine itself. It wants to pull off again and again and again. So you have to put all sorts of effort in, go in the straight path. So that's dukkha. And when Geshe Noam Dargay here is talking about the three kinds of suffering, the first noble truth. The first is the suffering of misery. Now, that's the one that we all understand. You know, sickness, mental and physical pain, hunger, thirst, main examples of this suffering. What we're reading in the newspaper and seeing on TV all the time. That's what most people, you know, their idea of suffering stops kind of right there. But then there's the suffering. The second kind of suffering is the suffering of change. And this obviously is a little more profound and subtle, but yet still recognized by folks. The impermanence of all things in samsara. And he says, for example, if we move from the shade to the sunshine, we enjoy the warmth at first. But then we become too hot, we again seek the shade. All samsaric pleasure has this aspect of impermanence, the nature of which is suffering or dissatisfaction that causes us to continually seek new sources of happiness. There's not a stable happiness. We have a temporary, you know, relief from the heat, but then we're too cold, and so we're seeking the heat again, around and around and around. Now, of course, people recognize more the dissatisfaction of impermanence, like when relationships end, or countries end, or someone's philosophy sort of gets becomes minority kind of view. So there are all sorts of things, especially in relationships, of course, that's usually in the popular press more covered than anything else. But the change, the suffering of change. But then finally, it's this third one. He calls it the suffering of extensiveness. Kyampa Dujad Ki Dug Nyal. I'm not sure if I said that right. You know, Tibetan, I can't read Tibetan really. They have transcriptions here, but they have all sorts of silent consonants in Tibetan. And then additionally, things are not necessarily pronounced the way that they're written, so not sure. But the suffering of extensiveness. And the Geshe gives a very kind of conventional, I don't mean and not sophisticated. I just mean there are different descriptions of the suffering of extensiveness. It's a more kind of inherent suffering in the dissatisfactory nature of how things appear to us, the nature of appearances. So he says this suffering is experienced not only in this life, but in all levels of samsaric existence. As soon as we take on a body, it acts like a magnet, which attracts suffering. Denizens of the hells must endure the suffering of heat and cold. Spirit beings, pretas, suffer from hungry ghosts, suffer from hunger and thirst. Animals from ignorance and stupidity. In the higher realms, humans suffer from birth, old age, sickness, and death. The anti-gods, the Asuras, suffer from jealousy and continual disappointment. And the Devas suffer during the last 7 days of their lives when they become aware that they're about to die. In possessing a samsaric body, we resemble a naked person carrying a bundle of thorns bound to their back by the rope of karma and kleshas. Thus, we must develop true renunciation of this third kind of suffering. So this is the subtle one that's harder for people to see. The example that's often given with it is they refer to the sensitivity of the bodhisattva, the wisdom of the bodhisattva, the enlightened bodhisattva, and seeing things as they are, a realized mind. In that, you know, for the ordinary person, if there's a human hair and it's lying on the back of your hand or in the palm of your hand, either way, or the back of your hand, you're not even aware of it. That's this third type of suffering, the suffering of extensiveness, the subtle one. Whereas for the bodhisattva, it said it's like that hair is stuck in the eye. They see things as they are, and they're never fooled. So this first noble truth of wanting the recognition of samsaric existence, having the nature of suffering, you know, is very profound. So the Geshe says, thus we must develop true renunciation of this third kind of suffering, seeking total release from all forms of samsaric existence. It is important to recognize suffering in the world, especially when it's occurring. The root of all suffering is our belief in the concept of our own fixed, independent self. And realization of shunyata, of emptiness, is like the knife that cuts the root of ignorance. Belief in a true, independent self-existence is like seeing a rope and mistaking it for a snake. Realization of emptiness is like recognizing the rope for what it actually is. With respect to a person, conventional truth is the five skandhas, or aggregates, which we falsely grasp as having self-existence. And ultimate truth is the void nature of all phenomena. It is our false concept of self-existence that causes the collection of karma. When the former is rectified, the latter disappears. This is the miraculous side, seemingly. But this suffering of extensiveness, in other words, in the very nature of appearances themselves, because of the gross kind of pain that can be experienced, because of the change of impermanence, and so we're always feeling off center, and then finally just the suffering of extensiveness. Every single thing, every single samsaric appearance is fraught with dissatisfaction. And of course, what we do is, outside of the Dharma, we're seeking refuges to one degree or another that are limited. Some are totally false. Some give a certain kind of protection from the suffering. But it's in the Dharma, this taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, where you're on the path, where you've entered into this practice and evolution, really, that will transform that suffering completely. But those three, and it's so helpful, I think, this first teaching out of the box, so to speak, of the nature of suffering, because you realize when you see people in dispute, they obviously don't know when something goes wrong. They have forgotten the problem of the First Noble Truth, because so much of our disappointment is that we think it should be different. We don't see things as they are, and the kind of the interesting aspect to it, to me, is that even in that disappointment, in a sense, we're having kind of like a memory or an intuition of our true nature. Because if we didn't have this feeling that things in their nature, things as they should be, would be satisfactory instead of dissatisfactory, we'd never be disappointed. So there's something in us that's actually awake from the get-go. Even this experience of suffering that we have, it's because we actually have a clear mirror that's holding up, like that tanka of the wheel of existence. It's so fascinating to me because the Chenrezig is in a wrathful form there and holding up this mirror that's reflecting the appearances, the six realms, and everything, all the things that are going on with it. So this First Noble Truth is exceptionally important and stabilizing. In one of the Pali Sutras, I haven't been able to find it for a while, but Ananda, so Buddha had 10 great disciples. Ananda was his cousin, and Ananda was his personal attendant. And it is Ananda, after the passing of the Buddha, that recollected the sutras. So you often hear in the beginning, "Thus have I heard." Sutras start like that. Well, that "thus I have heard," that's Ananda speaking, because he had a phenomenal memory and could remember all these incidents that the Buddha had. So in the Pali Sutras, it's like you're watching a movie or something on TV, because it's all conventional level truth. And so it's the story of the Buddha in his human form, which are very wonderful. The interactions that he had with so many people, really just wonderful, wonderful stories. We don't hear so much about those in the Mahayana, because the Mahayana, goes to Buddhahood itself, as far as realization of the same. And so suddenly, you're dealing usually with the Sambhogakaya, with all sorts of pure lands and, beings with their deeper meaning, you might say. But nonetheless, in this one sutra, Ananda, of the 10 great disciples, Ananda was the only one who did not come to full realization while the Buddha was alive, but he did after the Buddha passed away. And there's one of these where Ananda is asking, one of these stories where Ananda is asking Shakyamuni Buddha, he's going to ask him some question. I can't remember what the question was, but he prefaced it, as sometimes people do. He was saying, now I understand that the First Noble Truth, I understand that our apparent existence is dissatisfactory, is suffering, marked by suffering. But the question I want to ask is, and the Buddha stopped him, please stop right there. And he went into this description of how difficult or rare it is to fully understand the First Noble Truth. And he gave one of those examples that, is so rich in Buddhist literature and Indian culture too, of, describing the amount of time it takes to, I don't know, wear a stone Buddha statue down to the ground by passing a silk scarf over it once every century, things like that. But nonetheless, obviously gave the teaching. This is a profound teaching. And of course, when we know the history of why shouldn't it be, this is his first words, his first teaching words after his great enlightenment. And everything is based on that. So the First Noble Truth is exceptionally powerful and valuable because it keeps our head on straight all the time. And, compassion naturally comes out of that for the Mahayana for sure. So when Gretchen and I went to India in 1981, 80 and 81, we had not had any teachings like this, just our own reading and just, lots of meditation and meditation retreats and that kind of thing. And Gretchen went into a shop. We were staying in near Mangalatila, which is the Tibetan quarter of New Delhi. And we were actually staying at the Delhi YMCA, which is kind of a fascinating place because it just sort of reeks of colonialism. You go to have breakfast in the morning, it's a big dining room, and they've got like heavy silver table settings, and this nice china. Again, it's like very British. But then, the door opens to the kitchen and there's just like an army, it seems, of Indians are working and jabbering and all of this. But nonetheless, we were at the YMCA and Gretchen ventured out and found a shop. I don't think it was a Tibetan shop, but I think it was Indian. But it had, small Buddha statues and that. And actually, she bought one. But she was looking, and the shopkeeper started to talk to her in English, and they're conversing, and she said, "Yes, I am Buddhist." He asked, and he said, "Oh, so you are a follower of the Tenfold Noble Path?" Gretchen didn't know what he was talking about. That's the Fourth Noble Truth, but we'll get there in a couple of weeks. But nonetheless, the Four Noble Truths, the four Arya, meaning enlightened. This is the view of the enlightened person. So it's the noble ones. This is not a racial thing. The noble ones are those who are realized, deeply realized. And this is the truth of the noble ones. So that first one, the existence of suffering. Now, we had just started to move into the second noble truth, which is the cause. So when you really think about it, again, we have this ancient, in all schools of Buddhism, this schema, you might say, of learning, hearing. Typically, they call it hearing, but you either hear it because traditionally it'd be a teacher that was, most people were illiterate. Illiterate doesn't mean stupid; just means that they had oral traditions. But this first stage is hearing. Now, for us, that can be hearing teacher speak. It can be reading. It can be looking at a video. This process of learning, of acquiring introduction to and some level of knowledge. And then the second step is analysis, is thinking on that, cogitating with it, going around and around and around. And then meditation. Meditation means to grow accustomed to. So these truths that you come across first conceptually, then you start abiding in them. And of course, that conceptual knowledge transforms into experiential knowledge. That's the role of meditation. So these three, hearing, analyzing, and meditating. There's a degree of stability that comes to the mind, just hearing of this, just hearing about the Buddha, just hearing about the Dharma, just the hearing that there is a path. It's so liberating in itself, because if you think banging around in the dark, trying to get out of suffering, even if we're not conscious of what we're doing and just think it's just normal activity, but running around, and then suddenly there's this light, which is just hearing of the possibility. You mean there is an end to suffering? There can be an end to suffering? Someone's saying that? So for the first time, there's actually some directionality to the mind, but completely natural, not manufactured, because the understanding of these terms has suddenly come into the mind. Now, the more you hear, it starts to strengthen one's confidence, one's faith. In Sanskrit, the word that we translate as faith is shraddha, and it means more like confidence than often some of the meanings of faith in Western traditions. The idea that you're supposed to believe something that's unbelievable. More, this is confidence, so it's very active and interactive. But nonetheless, there suddenly is this spark. What makes the whole thing workable and makes the whole thing just calm and unfabricated is that spark is in complete accord with the spark in your own mind. And so there's truth. That's what validity is. It's not something manufactured. It's not something artificial, although it can take, a conceptual form, which in a sense is artificial or limited, but nonetheless, we can use what we've got. We don't have to somehow get to be some other sort of saint or some sort of other being. No, just the terms themselves, the conceptual understanding, hearing the Dharma, it brings a certain level of stability to the mind that otherwise would not be there. Or if it has been kind of there naturally, makes it even more stable. But this next step, the analysis, that leads to a greater stability too. And why shouldn't it? It's because you're testing it. You learn that patience, the teachings would say, is the antidote to hatred. That patience is better than hatred. That patience is in accord and is a reflection, you might say, of our true nature, whereas hatred isn't. Hatred's a delusion, a mistaken clinging. And so as we investigate that more and more and more and more and more, our confidence gets stronger, of course, because we're having experience and we're testing it intellectually. But then in the meditation, now we're abiding in that. We're going beyond conceptuality, and the light in the mind, the stability of the mind grows more. So there's a positive progress that's happening. So these teachings on the Four Noble Truths, the Geshe is going into great detail with them, so we can just get our questions answered, the doubts that we have, because the Dharma is gradual. It goes from step to step to step. So on the second Noble Truth, the cause of suffering, the idea that there is suffering, first of all, universal, is, liberating in itself. We stop running around trying to just bang our way out of the prison, so to speak. Instead, we're looking at the situation as it actually is, and we realize sort of what we're up against in a way and how profound it is. And of course, you can see how the compassion naturally comes out of the wisdom and even the learning, the knowledge. But the compassion is the part and parcel. It is the same nature. It is the result in a dualistic way, but it's not actually dualistic. But from the knowledge naturally comes compassion. When you understand that everybody's in this suffering state, already you have a relationship with them instead of this absolute, abyss between us and another human being. So the noble truth of the cause of suffering, and his broad outline talks about the cause of suffering, the source of suffering, the circumstances of suffering, and the violent development of growth of suffering. And here we start getting into some of the technical terms. So the two causes of suffering are karma and kleshas. Karma and kleshas. Karma means the secondary consciousness belonging to the primary stream of consciousness, and is automatically moves the latter like a magnet attracting a piece of metal. The primary mind thus collects the black and white karma of the secondary mind. So again, moves the latter like a magnet. So we have this primal mind. You could say beyond the suffering, beyond karma. But karma, this good and evil, this good, positive and negative, black and white, that's a secondary mind. One teacher has said that all of Buddhism is just summed up in karma and emptiness. Karma is how emptiness appears to us in a diluted state. So in wisdom, you might say that there's one mind. It's actually a mind of not two. It's a step subtler, but nonetheless, you can think of it as one mind. I mean, everything there exists in relation to everything else. So everything is dependent on everything else. Everything else is all of the same taste. So like in the Gonchik text, one taste. This is what it means. There's no division. There can be perfect discrimination, but there's no alienation and there's no opposition. Just one taste. That's the quality, you might say, of emptiness, whole and complete. But with a dualistic mind, the mind that's clinging to our idea of self, that interrelationship is karma. You do this, you get that. There's a relationship. And because there's a relationship that's not just some sort of random thing, we can count on it. We can rely on it. And so you end up with this, this great moral and ethical framework, which is the ultimate understanding, but playing out in a way that we can relate to it immediately. So this is great compassion because it's reaching out to unenlightened beings. There's just nothing like it. But in Tibetan, there are 3 synonyms for the primary mind, meaning the initial recognition of the nature of any object. They are primary mind, stream of consciousness, and mind. So those 3 terms are used. I have trouble reading the Tibetan. Sosem is primary mind. Stream of consciousness is namshe. So you sometimes see that word pop up in the text, namshe, stream of consciousness. And mind itself is yid. The secondary mind, sem jung, includes all the reactions that follow the initial perception. So think of that. Primal mind. This naked awareness or perception of an object. This isn't even necessarily realization, but it's just the primal mind, unfabricated, even though it might be on like a surface level of understanding, but nonetheless, you know, bingo, you see a chair. And then the secondary mind is our reaction to all of that. And if you think about it, we are generally living in our secondary reactions to reality. So we're already dealing in our ideas of reality, and then that gets more and more complicated. Then we're talking to other beings who are equally sort of immersed in their own reactions and emotionality, and it gets so infinitely complicated within 2 seconds. The mind in its entirety is of two kinds. The first is understanding free of illusion. And that has two aspects: the direct understanding of the nature of an object, and the second is the indirect understanding by means of reasoning. The mind in its entirety, understanding free of illusion, and that has two aspects: direct understanding of the nature and indirect understanding through reason. Second kind of mind, so the mind in its entirety is two kinds. One is this understanding free of illusion, but the second kind of mind is incorrect understanding, which is a mind clouded by illusion. And this has 5 different aspects. So here's the mind clouded by illusion. It has moments following the initial moment of perception of an object. That's one aspect of this illusory mind. And you see that, moments following the initial perception. You know, you hear a sound, but then that next millisecond, the secondary reaction to the sound. Second is wrong views or understanding caused by the 3 poisons. And they say this is like the yellowish visual perception of a person with jaundice. In other words, everything looks a little bit dull yellow. You don't even recognize it. You know, you don't recognize, you see that object seemingly with your pure perception, but yet it's stained, but it's so subtly stained. So this is another aspect of the illusory mind, the incorrect understanding. Third is doubt or skepticism. That is the mind which floats between 2 alternatives. So this is a big one, and especially in the West. You know, the ordinary Tibetan is interesting. I've had some experience with Tibetans who folks who aren't necessarily practitioners either, but you know, they've grown up with the respect of this tradition. It's kind of like the way that I respect Albert Einstein. I don't know what he did really. Someone talks about Max Planck, and I feel pretty good about that. I have no idea what he did. Or Newton, you know, or Galileo, any of these great figures. You know, we have this kind of natural confidence. So do the Tibetans for Dharma, even though they may have really no, you know, no special knowledge or even knowledge at all. But they're lacking in doubt. And doubt is very heavy in our culture, of course, doubt or skepticism. This doesn't mean the kind of doubt where your mind is open and you want to know. You know, the doubt that I don't know how to cook a cake, so I get a cookbook and it says this, you know, you're questioning. Questioning is not doubt. Doubt is what freezes you from acting. Guru Rinpoche said that the mind of doubt is like a 2-headed needle, and you've got a ball of yarn, and you can't go through the yarn. You get stuck there because it's a 2-headed needle. Get that fork. That's the mind of doubt. So the negative mind so far, we've got the moment following the initial perception, the wrong views that come from grasping to an independent ego. So these are especially the 3 poisons. Third, doubt or skepticism, the mind that floats between 2 alternatives, never this, never that. Fourth, never has any forward movement. Fourth is uncertain belief concerning that which is true. Now, we all have that. But again, through the process of hearing, analyzing, meditating, some of these things can take decades. But that sense of uncertain belief is slowly, you know, rectified. But finally, perception devoid of recognition and understanding. For example, while attentively listening to music, we may see visual objects later having no conscious memory of them. So these are perceptions devoid of recognition, something just floating through the mind. Of these five, the most harmful is wrong views. Wrong views are understandings caused by the three poisons, by greed, anger, and ignorance. Wrong view, as you remember, is one of the 10 non-virtues, and it's the most important of the 10 non-virtues, the non-virtue of mind. But conversely, when you start to learn these things too, then you realize that correct view, or just view, is therefore the greatest aid, because you can have just a completely conceptual understanding, but at the same time, you already are knowing what the Dharma is not and what is the wrong view. And so again, there's this path. There's this process that your mind is going through as you walk down to the day, go through the day. It never stops. This kind of questioning that's going on. It's a very good thing. All right. When we talk about primary minds, what do they mean? So they're talking about this initial perception of the primary mind, and then the secondary mind, the moment following the initial moments of perception. What are the primary minds? Well, they're the senses, basically. Visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, tactile, and mental consciousnesses. Eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, out of the Heart Sutra. So the senses, we all have those, but interesting in Buddhism, the thinking mind, the mental consciousness, is one of the primary minds. So there's an important distinction there, but it's important to understand that the root of virtue and non-virtue is the mind. And it is the power of the mind that motivates all acts. The mind is thus the most important of the six senses, and the only one which does not rely upon a physical organ. Primary mind, situated near the heart, understands directly, whereas the secondary mind, situated in the head, with its discriminating, differentiating power, understands through reasoning. So note this. They're not throwing it away. It's like I should just be living through my, immediate perceptions and throw away my thinking mind. Or, which is so much in the West, we're supposedly relying on the thinking mind as being the total thing that's going to get it done for us, artificial intelligence. And we ignore the heart. This is reflected in the Tantra, although it's not in this book. If, it's said that the peaceful deities reside in the heart. So Tara sitting on a moon disk, right, on top of a beautiful lotus. Why the moon disk? Because in ancient India, it's very hot, modern day India too. The light of the moon, though, you could look at the moon. It was peaceful. It was beautiful. It was pleasant. It was, not harsh, nothing that you couldn't do quite easily and naturally and just beautifully. So the peaceful deities then reside with this direct perception in the heart. And it's like a child. Each one of us at one time was an infant looking up at his or her mother. That immediate recognition of the heart, how powerful. But the wrathful deities, it said, live in the brain. And think about that. Here you have Vajrakalaya standing on a sun disk, and the moon disk is underneath it. So that sun, to look right at the sun is painful. It shows you the potential danger of the discriminating mind. Because if it's not based on emptiness, on truth, then the discrimination can go off in the wrong directions. I mean, to me, I've always used the example of, Hitler and the Nazis. Smart people, very, very sensitive to symbolism and nonverbal communication. He changed the German flag by just one color. He had it white red, and black because the contrast were, this message of just like power and energy and force. And after World War II, of course, they changed it back. What is it? White, red, and yellow. I can't remember, but it's the black, I think, that's gone. And for that matter, look what he did with the swastika. This powerful, powerful symbol of, in Buddhism, the 5 Buddha families, but certainly way back in Hinduism, of the solar symbol of the sun in the center and the rays coming out. It's just a powerful symbol. The Nazis switched it around. They reversed it. So I don't know if he knew what he was doing with that or not, but still you get this powerful image of that swastika. So you can have powerful discriminating mind, but if the view is wrong, it's even worse. So these primary minds, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, and mind is our mental consciousness, certainly the thinking. But the secondary minds, there are 51 secondary minds divided into 6 categories. I'm not going to get too much in the weeds here, but just to get the idea of it. What are these categories of the secondary minds? So again, primal mind, the initial experience, and the secondary mind, the instant after. So what are the 6 categories of the secondary mind? Well, one, that which always accompanies any perception of the primary mind, thus enabling the mind to make use of the object of perception. It's kind of esoteric. Then, second is the aspect of the mind which understands things individually as opposed to simple discrimination. Then third, the mind of virtue. And fourth, the 6 primary kleshas, which result in our continued wandering in samsara: ignorance, desire and attachment, anger and hatred, pride, doubting that which is true, and false views which arise from delusion. And some of those would be like grasping to the self as being permanent, the view that all phenomena inherently exist, belief that there's no karma, rebirth, or cause and effect, clinging to the above false views as being paramount, and believing that samsaric practices such as asceticism or idol worship have ultimate meaning. Those are delusions. And finally, the 20 secondary kleshas. So you have the kleshas in here as the 4th category of secondary minds. Then you have the 20 secondary kleshas. These are throwing karma produced by these kleshas, binds us to samsara, propels us into lower states of rebirth. So the growth of anger, these are throwing karmas, particularly strong. So it's just the arising of anger, that's one thing, but the growth of the anger, and then grudge holding, and then actions which result from anger. So not just the anger, which is bad enough, but acting out of it. And then the continual intention to harm others, such as killing an insect whenever we see one. Anyway, there are 20 of these things listed. So why all this detail, for one thing? Because again, we hear the Dharma, and then we move on to, in this process, of analyzing the Dharma. And for me, as a completely ignorant type, coming across this, I didn't see any of this stuff for after 16 years of practice before I came across this book. It allows you to certainly analyze and to tame your doubts, to penetrate those doubts, to use the questioning mind to get rid of the doubts. It's like they say, how do you get water out of your ear? Well, you pour a little water in, it liberates it. So the genius is that we're using our thinking mind. It's not trying to make ourselves stupid or primal or anything like that. We can use everything we've got. So we're convincing ourselves, you might say. And of course, that's good. Something that sort of worked for me too, for instance, was when you see the level of this kind of teaching and tradition, and the texts and the arguments within, and the commentaries, and you see, oh my goodness, this is, these are like very powerful, intelligent people working this out. This wasn't just sort of the mind eruption of some charismatic man or woman 100 years ago. And for a skeptical mind like mine, that's very helpful. It's just like I tell people sometimes, when the Dalai Lama won that Nobel Peace Prize in 1982, even communicating with your parents, for instance, there's something you could point to that would give them some degree of validity or confidence. I just like to say that somebody must have checked him out before they started giving out these awards, Nobel Peace Prizes. So, tremendous detail, karma and kleshas. Also gets into the role of faith in these secondary minds. So just to give you a taste of that, the third category of these 6 categories of secondary minds, the third one is the mind of virtue, which includes faith, awareness, keeping faith and awareness in our mind, the continuity of it, non-attachment, freedom from anger, freedom from ignorance, self-motivated, enthusiastic perseverance in following virtuous conduct, the power to control and use our mind and body in any way we like, resulting in mental ecstasy, alertness from non-virtuous deeds, equanimity or even-mindedness, and not being able to endure the suffering of others. So again, these are all aspects of faith. And of course, this is so helpful too, because you come across even just like one line of teaching in a text like this, and then you surprise yourself, but you see it functioning in your own life. Suddenly you feel sad about the suffering of an animal that you just happen to see, or some video, some sadness happening, and you can remember that this aspect of faith, not being able to endure the suffering of others. These teachings are so helpful because it allows you to sort of know yourself, have confidence in yourself, and not waste sort of doubt kind of energy wandering around. Because we have so many self-help kind of things floating around, and these kind of worldly beliefs that people think maybe they're supposed to ascribe to. For instance, not being able to endure the suffering of others, as opposed to just being tough. So when you find yourself moved by the suffering of others, you suddenly have support here. That's a positive thing. That's a positive aspect of faith. That's not a weakness, personal weakness. And so this is very helpful because, again, it's been worked out 2,600 years. This isn't that old, but it comes from those traditions of 2,600 years. Exceptionally helpful. Okay. This is all in the cause of suffering. So those are all the kleshas that they were going through, various states, primary minds, the reactions, the 6 senses of the primary mind, and then the 51 secondary reactions, which have both black and white, both faith and negative reactions. But then karma. So we got karma and kleshas. Karma, throwing karma is of 3 kinds: virtuous, non-virtuous, and unfluctuating. It's the force which propels one into the different states of existence. Karma produced by virtuous actions leads to rebirth in the human realm or one of the other two higher realms. Mount Meru is the center of this world system, surrounded by 4 continents with 2 islands around each one. We humans live in the southern continent, Jambudvipa, named after the splashing sound of a piece of wood dropped in water. Just love that. The splashing sound of a piece of wood dropped in water. Non-virtuous throwing karma leads to rebirth in one of the 3 lower realms. Unfluctuating karma results in rebirth in either the realm of form, in which there are 17 levels of existence, or the formless realm, in which there are 4 levels of existence. So that's unfluctuating karma. I don't know much about that. We humans live in the desire realm. Okay, so that's the cause of suffering. And in the book itself, it goes from page 19 through 25. You know, and again, just like one sentence, pithy statements. So tremendous detail on the cause of suffering. And as you go about, your life, doing what we do, what we have to do in our meditation, in our work, everything, you start to see how these things exist there. And so this is the nature of then abiding, meditating, without your legs crossed or anything, but suddenly, you've come to the teaching, you've read through these and having some understanding of analyzing all these categories, which seems overwhelming at first, but then you start to abide in them and you see them happening in your life. And again, it can be refined further. And it's this constant kind of reinforcement with these things. And this is the training. You think about like training a plant to grow up like, I forget what the term is, up the side of a wall. You see it like that. And you know how you're gently, with a tiny string or something, gently directing the shoot where it has to grow. And so you're putting this gentle kind of force on, and it's going that. Well, that's our rational mind. That's our discriminating mind as we read through these things. We're training our mind. Literally, it means that, onto this path. But of course, the truth of it is that it's a pathless path. It's only a path because we need a path. It's really our nature unfolding in a form that we can relate to, that is beneficial. And this is the incredible compassion of the Buddhas. It's said about Buddha Shakyamuni that he was great because he taught not in a pure land, but in this unpure land, this Saha realm. Saha means the realm of patient endurance. And isn't that the quality? You look at the great number of people around the world, people's lives. I mean, certainly there are dramatic moments of suffering and things that you can tell people about or that are in the newspapers. But, more and more, it's I can't remember one of the, Thoreau or Emerson has some phrase about it. I can't remember, but it always struck me, this Saha world, this patient, this just enduring, just going on and on and on. So the next one is third noble truth, the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. So we won't start there. We'll start there next time. But just to give you a flavor of the introduction here, this is so short, the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. The first 2 noble truths, right? The existence of suffering, causes of suffering. The first 2 noble truths are themselves kleshas, whereas the last 2 are the equivalent to nirvana and the path to attain it. The fruit of the cessation of suffering is peace and never-ending joy. To attain this cessation, we need to cut the fetters of the klesha. Having done so, there is no possibility of falling back into suffering. So we're going to the cause. But the second noble truth is the cause. If you eliminate the cause, you eliminate the result automatically. Most people, however, do not have patience in applying the methods of escaping from this jail of samsara. Recognizing that one has no worse enemies than one's own kleshas, one's afflictions, poisonous mind states. The truly brave person conquers the 6 root and the 20 secondary klesha, thus becoming an arhat, meaning one who overcomes enemies. There are 2 kinds of obstacles. First, klesha avarana includes the 26 major and minor kleshas, which must be eliminated before arhatship or nirvana can be attained. The second, Jnana avarana, is the instinct of clinging to the illusion of independent self-existence. And it is this which blocks the way to the full enlightenment of Buddhahood. So we'll get into that more. But this incredible teaching of cause and effect, again, which is emptiness as perceived, experienced by the dualistic mind. You cut out the cause, you've cut out the result. It's so radical. Lama Tarchan, a subtle view of this is our wrong appearances, the whole arising of this impure realm. And he said it's like there's a great mountain and there's a mountain lake halfway up the mountain. And this lake is the lake of suffering. And through, he's talking about tantric practice, through that tantric practice, by getting your lung, your winds in the central channel instead of all the side channels that are going in all the time and supporting this view of samsara, actually creating samsara, you get the winds into the central channel, the mountain disappears. And when the mountain has disappeared, there's no lake of suffering. You don't have to bail out the lake. You don't have to work to try to make the lake go away. You just simply have to get your winds in the central channel. All of these teachings are getting our winds into the central channel, but they're doing it in a conventional, dualistic, sutric kind of way. So the Tantra is just, further mental refinements, but completely not contradictory to the sutric teachings, the conventional teachings, the teachings that allow us with a dualistic mind to fully involve ourselves in the path. Okay, maybe a good place to stop. And questions, I didn't stop for questions, and I'm just such a big blowhard talker. Anything from anybody tonight? Questions or comments? No problem. All right, good night, everyone. We'll end with just a brief dedication. May the merit of the understanding of these teachings be shared equally with all sentient beings. To the degree that they can understand, may they understand. And by cutting the root of suffering, may they be free. Svaha. Okay. Okakeki.